Ben Hodges is a retired U.S.Army Lieutenant General and former commander at the U.S. Army Europe. Welcome to our program, General Hodges.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
As the war in Ukraine nears its third year, where the war is headed right now, from your perspective?
I think that after 11 years of war and all the damage and casualties that Russia has suffered, the Black Sea Fleet is a non-factor. The Russian Air Force has failed to achieve air superiority over Ukraine, even over their own troops. Russian economy is in trouble. Ukraine is increasing its ability to destroy Russian oil and gas infrastructure. And in the reports I see from Ukrainians is that the intensity of Russian attacks seems less than what it was for weeks now. Russia is not able to eliminate the Ukrainian bridgehead inside Kursk. And this is without the U.S. or anybody else actually committing to saying we want Ukraine to win, and without putting full economic pressure on Russia. So if you ask me how it's going, of course, if you're in the infantry in the trench outside Pokrovsk, it's terrible. But if you can step back and think big picture, Ukraine is in a very strong negotiating position. Of course, for me, I wish that my government and others would say, we want Ukraine to win, and we're going to do everything necessary for Ukraine to win. That's not what's happening. So I think probably, how's it going? I think Ukraine is actually in a strong position right now.
Do you feel that the war is headed toward the end right now? Any signs of that?
I think that there were false expectations based on what President Trump said before he was president, that this is going to be done in 24 hours, and then it became 100 days, and now, who knows? I mean, there's a lot of mixed signals. I listened to your president just now here in Munich, President Zelensky, and I mean, he is, what an amazing leader he is. And I think that he knows that, as he said, this is my country, so it will be my plan, not just accepting whatever two other leaders might dictate. And I think that that's as it should be. So this negotiation process probably will go on for quite some time. I don't think it's going to end in the next 2 or 3 months, unless there's some massive breakthrough, because nobody on the planet believes that Putin would live up to any agreement. And so without some kind of force to compel him to live up to the agreement, it's unlikely. And so then finding who will provide this force, who, you know, all those kind of things, I think will have to be taken into account.
I will also cover with you peacekeeping missions after another topic, but I would like also to focus our attention on the recent statement from the J.D. Vance. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance told the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. could use military means of pressure on Putin, even he did not exclude sending troops to Ukraine. What could be the U.S. military options for Ukraine in case of a ceasefire? How can the U.S. government support this mission from the air, on the ground, with boots on the ground, with money, or only with intelligence?
Well, actually, yes to all of those. I mean, and that was the good thing that the Vice President said, so that the Russians should worry that everything that we could do is on the table, everything. Now, whether or not they ever intend to actually do that, but you know, I thought it was a mistake when President Biden said back in 2021, no boots on the ground. That was even before the Russian large-scale invasion. Why would you say that? And so while I have some questions and problems with much of how the Trump administration is approaching this, I was glad to hear the Vice President say, yes, we may do this, we may do this, we may do this. The Kremlin should worry about that. President Trump has so much more leverage over the Kremlin now than he did 4 years ago or 8 years ago. I've already talked about what bad state the Russians are in. On the other side, the United States economy, President Trump comes in with a very strong U.S. economy. The vast majority of the Congress supports Ukraine. So he's got all the congressional support. I just came from speaking to a U.S. senator, a Republican, and he said the vast majority of Congress supports Ukraine. So the president has everything he needs. You remember General Kellogg said, we, on a scale of 1 to 10, we probably are a 3 in terms of sanctions. So that means there's so much more that can be done. That's leverage. The president could say, okay, Putin, you're not negotiating in good faith, so we're going to open up the warehouse, and everything that we have that Ukraine needs, we're sending it without restrictions. So these are all things that could be done. It's not going to happen like that, but the Russians should worry that it could happen like that. Now, one of the things that I think has increasing appeal is the idea of the U.S., Poland, Romania, other countries providing some sort of air defense, at least for the western half of Ukraine, somehow to help knock down missiles that are coming in, drones. That would be more difficult than it sounds, but if hopefully somebody's actually working on that, maybe that is a possibility. They will have to do it before a peacekeeping force. I mean, that will have to be in place before any peacekeeping force might go into Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of things that could be done. Speed up the delivery. I mean, we have been, for a lot of different reasons, some of them are legitimate reasons, it's been slow. I know slower than what the military leadership wanted, the U.S. military leadership. It's been slower getting things there than what they wanted. So these are all things that we could do.
So you're confident that Trump's administration has enough power to force Putin to agree with this ceasefire plan if such measures are imposed?
I am very confident of that. Well, of course, what I don't know, this is only part of a bigger thing. I think negotiations are probably not just about a ceasefire or a line somewhere. I think it's probably connected to other things. And of course, every member of the administration always talks about China. So whatever is being worked out with regards to Ukraine, they have an eye towards China also. And the Chinese should see that we are willing to do all these things to defend our interests, sovereignty, freedom of navigation, etc. The Chinese should be worried. If they don't see us doing this, then I think they're not so impressed with what we say about the Pacific.
How much time could take these negotiations with Vladimir Putin and his team? Bloomberg reported that he was forming a professional team of negotiators and mediators. How much time would it take for Trump to force Putin to ceasefire?
Of course, that's an impossible question to answer. Anybody that says it's going to be done by a certain date, that is 100% wishing or guessing. I've seen people talk about, they want to get it done by 9 May so that you can have this big... I'm sure Putin would love nothing better than that, to have victory, and have the American president at Red Square. Oh my God. But this is people speculating about things. Any date or deadline is, at least in public, is artificial. And the Russians should believe that we're prepared to do this until we get to the point where President Zelensky says, I'm good with this. So however long that is.
And also from your perspective, these negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States and the front lines. Also, Pete Hegseth commented on that, and he made one interesting statement that he does not rule out providing Ukraine with nuclear weapons if Trump decides to do so. What is your reaction to this interesting statement?
Yeah, I think Secretary Hegseth has come under some criticism from even Republican senators about what he said in Brussels there. So, and then the very next day, he, of course, began to walk back. So I think, I mean, let's be candid, it's still in the first weeks of a brand new administration. There's always going to be some mistakes made. I can't, it's hard to imagine any scenario where that would be approved. And keep in mind, and there will be some people in Ukraine that will remember this from when Ukraine did have nuclear weapons. This is so expensive. I mean, almost of the British defense budget, okay, which is close to like 2.5% of their GDP, 1% of their GDP is just to pay for their nuclear force, which is very small. So, in other words, almost half of the British budget, defense budget, is to maintain a modern nuclear force. So, I don't think serious people really believe that this would be helpful for Ukraine, even if this were a feasible thing. And I think the United States, no matter who, it's Republican, Democrat, Congress, nobody would see benefit for violations of the non-proliferation treaty. I think it's in our interest that Ukraine not feel that it had to do that.
And also, so you're confident that only conventional weapons would be needed for Ukraine to deter another Russia's attack in the future?
Yeah. I think whether it's capabilities that Ukraine manufactures itself or long-range weapons, air defense weapons, conventional artillery, all of these things, whatever is needed for Ukraine to win this war, that's what we should be providing without interruption.
Do you feel that Vladimir Putin now is interested in agreeing with a ceasefire deal? Do you feel that he suffers enough and enough pain is being inflicted on Putin, Kremlin, and all Russia's allies to agree with ceasefire deal this year?
Well, of course, he doesn't care about how many soldiers of his that are killed or damage that's done. I think he continues this war as long as he thinks that we will quit. I don't see him saying, "Oh, we've 1 million casualties," which will happen in a couple of months. They'll hit 1 million, maybe even sooner. I don't think he'll say, "Oh, that's too many. We got to stop." His survival depends on being at war and at least giving the illusion somehow that Russia is winning or going to win. So his survival is tied to that. So I have believed for the last couple of years that his only hope was to wait and hope that the U.S. would turn its back, try to get some kind of deal, and then be done. And I think when the day he realizes that's not going to happen is the day he begins trying to figure out how does he extract himself.
Do you feel that there is any kind of feeling of regret in Kremlin regarding this whole military disaster in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, of course, I can only speculate based on what different people in Russia say, you know, the talking heads, the propagandists, the different people that talk on Russian talk shows. You've got people over here saying we should have used a nuclear weapon, we should have killed these guys, you know, and then over here it's like, what a huge mistake. And it does feel a little bit more and more that people are coming out saying that this was a mistake, and they're feeling brave enough to be able to say that publicly. I think that says something. But in terms of serious government figures saying this was a mistake, I don't think we'll hear that.
And can you imagine a feeling of regret in Putin's head?
Well, dictators don't have a retirement plan. I mean, they stay in power for life, because usually bad things happen to dictators when they try to step down unless they have a really clear, strong succession program. And I don't know who that is in Russia. So the regret probably comes from oligarchs who no longer have their flat in London, or have their kids going to school in Switzerland, or their yacht has been impounded down in Naples, or wherever. They probably have personal regret about their own life, but I don't know how many of them would actually say we should have stopped Putin. This was a terrible idea. All this destruction. We lost our Ukrainian friends, and I don't get that feeling.
Also, like to cover with you this a ceasefire plan. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is ready to deploy boots on the ground and planes in the air as a part of a ceasefire deal. What is your take on such plan, and is it possible to conduct this mission without American backstop, without US backstop?
Well, I think there are two options here. First of all, there is an option where a European coalition force led by Britain and by France put troops on the ground, sufficient amount, 30 to 40,000 troops, and they must have enough military grunt, as it were, armored divisions to be able to oppose any potential Russian incursions. And in the first instance, the ideal situation would be if the US provided the air power to maintain air superiority with US fighter jets and missiles and others to cover that force. If the US is not prepared to do that, then the European NATO coalition must stump up. And I think what Europe needs to make abundantly clear to both President Trump and President Putin that we are prepared to do this. And I personally believe that there is enough military capability within the European NATO coalition to do this. The air forces of Finland and Sweden, Britain, France, Greece, Germany, and some of the other smaller European countries, I think, have enough fighter jets and missile defense to provide this air cover, but it's not ideally. So that is the option. I think it's very doable. A lot of planning has been going on in London and Paris and elsewhere to make sure that this force is ready. And of course, the European NATO countries have been doing a lot of training together over the last 12 months to 2 years. So they are ready to do it. This will be a huge commitment for the British and French militaries, but it is essential, I think, to get peace and stop innocent Ukrainian civilians being killed on a daily basis by the Russians. Ideally, we'd like the Americans involved, but I think we can, in Europe, do it ourselves and provide a sufficiently robust force to deter Putin and the Russians from trying to gain any more land.
From your perspective, how should British, French and other European troops retaliate if Russia violates a ceasefire deal, if Russia attacks Ukraine again, and if Russia attacks European troops?
Well, when the ceasefire force is set up and the line of demarcation between Ukrainian and Russian forces is set up, there must be very clear rules of engagement. In other words, what happens for exactly the scenario that you're talking about. What is absolutely clear and fundamental is that any European peace enforcement force must have the firepower, the tanks, the artillery, the drones, and the air power to be able to stop any Russian incursion. And I think that it clearly can have if we put enough forces on the ground. Of course, it's a huge area. The demarcation line is likely to be about 800 miles long. So it's a huge area to cover, but with sufficient firepower. I think that a European coalition, ideally supported by American air power, can do that. And the Russian army itself is much denuded. They've just passed 1 million casualties. It's clear that they're not very well trained now. So I think a very well trained European NATO armored division, infantry division, would have the capability, and also with the intelligence assets that Europe and the US have, to be able to either hopefully deter the Russians from doing anything, and if they did do something, to hit them really hard very quickly.
And do you feel that European countries are capable of hitting Russia very hard without American involvement?
Well, I think it will be more difficult without American involvement. But yes, I'm pretty clear that we could do this. You know, British and French, all the British and French and the Nordic countries' armies are highly trained. They have a lot of very sophisticated kit, and a lot of the kit is American kit, F-35 fighters, etc. So yes, I think they do have the ability. It will be about the rules of engagement. And also, I think Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron are making it clear that they are up to the task and prepared to do it. And they must be. Unless Russia believes that, then the force will not be effective.
From your perspective, what are the options for the US government for their involvement in such mission? Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, is trying to persuade Trump to commit to such mission, for example, by staging air assets in the countries near Ukraine on standby in case of Russia's attack against Ukraine. The US could, for example, retaliate with air assets and long-range capabilities. What are the US options for this mission?
Well, the key option, we hope, is that US air assets will be committed to any peacekeeping force. There's some significant US assets, air assets, fighter jets, etc., already stationed in the United Kingdom in 3 very large air bases and across Europe as well. And one would hope that they will be the guarantor of air power to this peace enforcement force. So that is really what I think Prime Minister Starmer is trying to convince President Trump to commit to the fight. But we also must plan for a worst case contingency where Trump doesn't. But I think also as part of President Zelensky's peace proposals, he's also indicated that he is prepared to look at the rare earth minerals deal that President Trump seems so keen on. And one anticipates if that deal can be agreed, then in the transactional way that Trump seems to do political and diplomatic business now, then once Trump has access to Ukraine minerals, Ukraine or the coalition peace force would have access to US air power.
Also, US Vice President J.D. Vance says that economic cooperation with the US would be the best security guarantee for Ukraine. He is confident that European allies are not capable of conducting such mission because, he said, quote, that they haven't fought wars for 30, 40 years. What is your reaction to such misinformation, lies from J.D. Vance?
Well, there are 2 things here. Firstly, the comments of J.D. Vance, which I've written about extensively in the British press, for a person who has fought in the Gulf Wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan and Bosnia and Kosovo wars. With a lot of my colleagues, we're pretty vexed by what Mr. Vance has to say. And although he was apparently a soldier once, I think his combat experience is very limited. So it was an unfortunate comment. Mr. Vance seems to say things first and then think later, because of course he's now retracted that comment, saying he didn't think it was the case that British and French soldiers had not been in combat. So I think that's unfortunate, but it wouldn't really matter. But the fact that he's vice president of the USA is a huge concern if that is his judgment. I think on the first point that you mentioned about Ukraine having security by doing business with the US, I think he believes that if there are US personnel in Ukraine, maybe working in the mines and other areas of business, helping with reconstruction, then Putin wouldn't attack for fear of injuring or killing US personnel. And there is some merit in that. However, there were lots of US personnel in Kuwait in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So that's not necessarily a definite guarantor. But as far when it comes to experience of the British and French military, I personally have been fought in 7 different wars, and a lot of my colleagues are similar. So we're a lot more experienced than Mr. Vance in combat. So perhaps he should stick to politics.
Let's cover also nuclear option of the Russian side. If there is a European peacekeeping mission, European deterrent force in Ukraine, what are the chances of Russia using nuclear weapons against European troops?
Well, that is a very good question. I think it's overall, I think it is highly unlikely. Firstly, I say that because both Britain and France have a nuclear deterrent, although it is much, much smaller than the Russians. The combined nuclear weapons of Britain and France are enough to annihilate Russia anyway, and Putin will know that. There is some discussion that the Russians might try and use tactical nuclear weapons. These are smaller ones to take out particular armored formations and others. Again, I think this is highly unlikely. The French do have some tactical nuclear weapons, so could respond. But I think, as we've discussed on your program before, the launching of any tactical nuclear weapons, I think a coalition NATO peace enforcement force would have the capability with the weapons like Storm Shadow to prevent them being launched. So I personally think the nuclear issue, as we've discussed many times before over the last 3 years, is a non-issue, because Putin knows that the moment he flexes his nuclear weapons, that is the end of it. And that is not what we understand he wants to achieve. So, yeah, I think that the chance of a nuclear exchange is very remote.
But don't you think that Russia could try to challenge, to test the readiness of European troops by conducting, for example, false flag operations or small incursions? What is your take on that?
Yes, I think that's very likely. And I am sure that the coalition troops will be contingency planning for that. And if there is any slight incursion, it's very important that the coalition force hits it very hard. When it comes to false flag, that is more difficult, of course, but that is where intelligence is key. Of course, we rely very heavily on US intelligence to provide a clear picture. And one would, that it is pretty essential that intelligence still goes on. Although, having said that, among the UK and France and the other NATO European countries, they still have a very considerable intelligence gathering capability. But the key thing is, if there is any transgression of the ceasefire rules, then it is hit very hard indeed.
And also, do you expect European troops, European air assets, and, for example, if this is a case, American air assets to help Ukraine to close a sky over Ukraine, to help Ukraine to deter and also to intercept Russia's missiles in case of a large missile attack on Ukraine?
Well, I think there are two elements to this. If there is a ceasefire in place, yes, absolutely, coalition air assets would take out any incursions into Ukraine by Russian missiles or drones or jets. as far as Western assets supporting Ukraine, if there is no ceasefire, then that is something that we must consider, because if there is no ceasefire and the fighting continues, I expect particularly the European NATO coalition must reevaluate how they support Ukraine. What is very clear in the West, in Europe, is that we cannot afford, well, we will not allow Russia to take Ukraine completely. So there is a scenario, and it's a worst case scenario, where British and French troops might have to be on the ground to support Ukraine against Russia, and fighter jets in the air. I would add that that is worst case scenario, but if there is a ceasefire in place, absolutely coalition air power would take out any missiles fired at Ukraine.
But would coalition forces have enough air defense systems to protect, for example, its own troops on the ground in Ukraine? Because Prime Minister Keir Starmer is also trying to convince Trump to provide European allies with additional air defense assets. What is your opinion on that?
Well, we're getting in some sort of quite technical detail, and I being a soldier, I'd never sort of professed to completely understand the air environment, as it were. It is a very good point that you make, but I am sure that the British and French and the European coalition would not want to deploy troops into a ceasefire line without the right air defense cover. It's a technical issue. I intuitively think that with all the air assets that are available in Europe, it is possible, but of course it would be far easier with the Americans providing the backstop and the support to cover the air. But if that's not the case, then Europe is going to have to do the best it can.
And what could happen if Russia, for example, attacks Ukraine not from the Russian territory, but, for example, from a territory of Belarus? How should European allies respond?
Well, I think it's the same deal with the ceasefire. The rules of engagement will be very clear, and I'm sure they will say any incursion into Ukraine by the Russians will be dealt with severely by a European force, whether that's across the contact line between Ukraine and Russian forces, or whether it's through a second country like Belarus.
Also, let's cover the topic on the war in Ukraine on the ground. Russia's offensive on the east of Ukraine has been slowed down by the Ukrainian army. Ukraine tries to stabilize the front lines. Do you feel that this development can force Russia to seek peace in the nearest future, to agree with ceasefire proposal, because their offensive operations have been slowed down?
Well, certainly it would appear across the front at the moment things are pretty quiet. And people should not forget, of course, that Ukraine holds an area of Russia as well in Kursk, where their operations have failed and stalled. So it gives some advantage to Ukraine. I personally think that in what we call in military terms, the Russian army has culminated. In simple words, it means that it's run out of steam, run out of power. It really can't go much further. So I think any negotiations that happen between Ukraine and Russia, then that needs to be made very clear, because there is obviously some detailed negotiations over land to consider. The Russians have taken 4 oblasts and, of course, the Crimea. And at the moment, Ukraine holds an area in Kursk. So there will be negotiations on what the ceasefire line looks like. But I think the world needs to understand that certainly my personal view is that the Russian army is pretty much spent at the moment and would be pushed to really make much more gains if the war carried on and the West did nothing to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.